Tonight on Nation to Nation, justice lawyers say they'll fight First Nations kids in court over child welfare compensation. But the Indigenous Services Minister says they just need more time. This NDP MP reads between the lines.
That they punt and they feint and they misrepresent and they promise they're going to get to something, but they work on the assumption that we don't have all the facts.
There's a new Conservative critic for Indigenous services, and he hopes his role isn't just one-dimensional.
Potentially work together to help solve issues rather than just be at odds with each other all the time.
Hello, I'm Todd Lamoran, and welcome to Nation to Nation. The Trudeau government continues to fight First Nations kids in court. Whether it's delaying an order from the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal to compensate kids in care, or backtracking on a promise to not block the certification of a class action lawsuit of former kids in care. The federal government says they will pay survivors and their families eventually, but no one knows the total number of children who've gone through the child welfare system. That's because for years Ottawa has not tracked them properly. We have exclusive information that the feds are hoping to fix that through a new national data and reporting strategy. Also, our next guest says there's another important reason why we need to know exactly how many kids have been in care, and that's NDP MP Charlie Angus. Mr. Angus, welcome to Nation to Nation.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Now, before we talk about this exclusive information, just before Christmas, you asked the Parliamentary Budget Officer to do a cost out of the Human Rights Tribunal compensation and the class action lawsuit. I mean, they're two separate things, but you wanted a cost of both of them.
Well, I think one thing, the viewers really need to remember when you're dealing with this government is that they punt and they feint and they misrepresent and they promise they're going to get to something, but they work on the assumption that we don't have all the facts and the details. I've asked the Parliamentary Budget Officer to cost out what the compensation looks like. Once we have those facts, it's a lot harder for the government to keep playing these games and misrepresentations. It's really, really vitally important that we have a sense of what Canada is on the hook for. And it's also important to say that the government's admitting past wrongs. They're not admitting that the system is still destroying families and destroying children. That's one of the huge problems. So let's find out what the compensation really needs to look like, but we still have to keep this government's feet to the fire. They are still running a broken, underfunded system, and children's lives are still being destroyed.
I guess that suggests that there'll be more people to compensate in the future. When do you think your request to the Parliamentary Budget Officer will be wrapped up?
I'm really hoping that the government will not interfere or delay. The Trudeau government is setting a really bad pattern of not wanting to go along and with the request of the Parliamentary Budget Officer. And again, for the viewers, the Parliamentary Budget Officer works for Parliament. His job is to assess numbers, to verify facts, so that we know what we're dealing with. I know that the Parliamentary Budget Office takes the issues of Indigenous inequity very seriously. They've done excellent reports on the water crisis. They've done excellent reports on education. They are very keen, I think, to get to the bottom of what we're looking at in terms of numbers. And those numbers, I think, will really help dictate the future direction and negotiation with the government.
I guess here's the catch, though. The feds don't know how many kids are in the system today or any year before because it's not been tracked correctly. I mean, does that surprise you in any way?
Unfortunately, nothing surprises me with the federal government's denial of basic rights to Indigenous children. During the suicide crisis that we had in 2015, 2016 in Attawapiskat, I asked Health Canada, do you track children who are being denied services who end up suicidal or dying? And they said, of course, because these are direct requests for mental health services to First Nation Inuit Health Services Branch. And I said, surely to God you keep records. And they said, of course we keep records. And then we went to find out what the records were. They said, well, it's not really our job to keep records. So this is the pattern with them. We don't really know how many kids have been taken. We know the feds pay money out, but they are not being responsible for getting a sense of how many children have been taken, how many children have been taken many times over. Are they new cases, individual cases, or some children have been put in foster care again and again and again. So those numbers we need to break out and get a better sense of.
So how do justice lawyers come up with a figure of $5 to $8 billion just for the Human Rights Tribunal compensation order?
Well, you can't trust the Justice Department lawyers on anything when it comes to Indigenous justice. They've fought 12 years. They've spent millions of dollars. They are determined to litigate. So they come up with a very high figure to say, this is outrageous. Of course we can't pay any of this, because they don't want to turn over whatever data they have that might be more reasonable. That's why the Parliamentary Budget Office will help, I think, everyone get a better sense, so that we can go back to the Justice Department lawyers and say, come on, stop playing games, sit down and negotiate. And that's really where we need to be at the end of the day. We need this government to admit that they have been responsible for systemic racist discrimination against children, and children have died. We need to fix this. And the longer the government fights and prevaricates and puts up legal tactics, more children are going to be taken away from their families, more children are going to lose identity, and more children will end up dying. And that's not acceptable.
Will a reporting strategy from the government to do anything to fix some of these gaps in knowledge?
The only real changes that we've seen, in Jordan's principle, for example, that was brought after, I think, the 4th non-compliance order at the Human Rights Tribunal, are firm orders that the government has to meet. If you leave it up to them, they're going to do a lousy job. That's their long history, and I'm sorry, I just don't have any faith in them doing the right thing unless they're forced to do the right thing, which is why we have to go to court, which is why these class actions may be necessary to force compliance, so that they respond to the fundamental problem, which is the broken system.
I know that I asked you about this a couple of days ago up on the Hill. The Trudeau government says it does want to compensate and wants to bring everything into one big giant settlement, I suppose. But if they're going to do that, why are they going back to court?
Well, I think what we've seen with the independent assessment process with the residential school survivors and then the claims for the day school survivors is they want a system that they can control. And when they can control it, Indigenous people get screwed over. The reason they really hate the Human Rights Tribunal ruling is that the Human Rights Tribunal said this is basically the worst case of racist discrimination they've ever seen, and because of the belligerence of the government, has forced an order on them. The government wants to control the process. If the government controls the process like they did in the independent assessment process for residential school survivors, justice will be denied. They will be in charge. It will be the Justice Department lawyers that set the terms and conditions, and that's not good. So they are trying to quash the order in federal court, and part of their tactic in federal court was to say, oh, but we'll support another process. They're always about to support another process if you allow them to kill this process. No, we're not going to let them kill the Human Rights Tribunal ruling, and they are going to have to deal with the class action lawsuit. But any global solution being offered by Minister Carolyn Bennett or Mark Miller, be very wary of.
It almost seems like they're playing the tribunal order against the class action lawyers. Do you think this is a deliberate strategy, or what are we looking at here?
It's completely a deliberate strategy to go into federal court and say, hey, we want to quash a ruling that we fought for 12 years, the Human Rights Tribunal. We don't want them to have any jurisdiction over us, but trust us, we'll support a class action and that'll be better. And then when we find out that they can't quash the order, they turn around and say, well, we're not going to support that class action lawsuit either. So it's about delay. It's about misrepresentation, and it's about fighting one legal battle and then going and fighting the next legal battle. What I'm saying to Justin Trudeau is stop it. Just stop the toxic legal battles and admit that things have to get fixed, and these children deserve compensation. Once we get there, a whole manner of positive things will start to happen in this country.
Do you think we talk about positive things we want to happen in this country over this mess, over kids in care? Do we need a national inquiry over all this?
I would certainly love to see a deeper inquiry into how these systems operate, why children are being failed. We've lost so many. We don't even really know the numbers that we've lost. I mean, we lose a child on a Monday, we lose a child on a Wednesday, we lose a child on a Friday, and nobody knows and nobody seems to care. It would be something I think could be very helpful. But again, we've got a long history of inquiries in Canada where the government cries crocodile tears and says sorry and nothing changes. I'd like to point to the Truth and Reconciliation that did enormous work, and it showed us what happened and showed us a way forward. But with this generation of children, they're still being taken just like their grandparents were taken. And it's part of a much broader thing. And to say, oh, it was just a 60 scoop or it was the residential schools, it is the pattern of how Canada has tried to destroy Indigenous children and their families. And it's still ongoing and it's still in place.
I suppose regardless of the issue of compensation, child welfare reform is supposed to fix things, but there are complaints about the way it was rolled out. We don't have funding for it. So do you have any confidence that C-92 is the way forward, the future?
Well, we had a lot of hope when the government announced that they were going to bring forward legislation and recognize that they have an obligation with legislation. The problem is they don't put any money to it. And that's the fundamental problem. I mean, they've been found guilty of systemic discrimination because they refuse to fund. So simply saying to First Nation family and communities, yes, of course you have the right and obligation to look after your children. We just will make sure you don't have the resources to do it. That perpetuates the discrimination. And that's, you know, when we get down to all the fundamental failings, it's because the federal government refuses to have a level playing field where children in non-Native communities are given a certain level of funding and children on reserve are given much lower. And until we address that, it doesn't matter how often you make commitments to decolonize, it's still the colonial system.
Well, we'll have to see what happens in next month's budget. Mr. Angus, I want to thank you for coming to speak to me this morning.
Thank you so much.
After the break, I speak to the Conservative Party's new Shadow Minister of Indigenous Services. Welcome back. It's been about 2.5 years since Indigenous Services and Crown Indigenous Relations were created as separate departments. During that time, the Conservative Party maintained one critic of Indigenous Affairs, Cathy McLeod, someone who was on Nation and Nation a lot during that time. But now, two critics, or shadow ministers, do that role. Ontario MP Jamie Schmale shadows Minister Carolyn Bennett, while my next guest shadows Minister Mark Miller. Gary Vidal is an MP from Northern Saskatchewan, having defeated NDP MP Georgina Jollybois back in October. Mr. Vidal, welcome to Nation to Nation.
Thank you, Todd. My pleasure to be here.
Now, how surprised were you that you defeated Ms. Jollybois?
I don't think I would say I was surprised. I didn't set out to do this expecting to lose, but and we were very thankful to a number of people that worked very hard for us to achieve this outcome, and we will always be grateful to those people.
Mr. Vidal, there were a lot of Indigenous people in your riding, of course, but a lot of them voted for Liberal and NDP, according to a riding profile. So I guess what are you going to have to do to kind of win them over to what you're going to do here in Ottawa?
What I've always set out to do is do exactly what I did when I was mayor of the city of Meadow Lake. One of the really unique relationships and partnerships we created there was with Flying Dust First Nation, which is a literally neighboring community to my little city of Meadow Lake. And we had a very good working relationship with the leadership and the people from the Flying Dust First Nation and the Meadow Lake Tribal Council. That maybe goes back to my years as hockey coach, my years as an accountant in the region, and some other things. But what we did there is we just tried to have honest and authentic relationships with them in our city to First Nations relationship. We got a lot of good work done that way, and I guess it's been my goal to say, hey, take what I've learned doing that over the years while I was the mayor, the things I've learned while I coached many of these kids from Northern Saskatchewan in hockey programs, and try to expand it to this role of member in Parliament and just make sure I build honest and authentic relationships with all of the people in Northern Saskatchewan.
Oh, does that mean you played some hockey too back in the day?
I played some hockey back in the day, but it's been an enjoyable journey.
Because I think I saw a YouTube video of you, one of the few, when we first trying to get to know you, get some video on you. You were in a hockey rink, but I believe the team has gone out of business, unfortunately, by now.
Yeah, you might be referring to them like Mustangs or something.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, I could have been in an arena during one of their events. I go to lots of the senior hockey games. My son plays hockey there still, and just my experience coaching kids over the years has been a tremendous journey for me. So.
Well, you talked about the Flying Dust First Nation, and I believe that was part of your first question in QP. You asked about a softwood lumber company owned by the First Nation Economic Development Company. And it seems that, talking about economic development in the House of Commons is a typical page out of the Conservative playbook. But will that be enough to, I suppose, change people's minds generally in the whole riding about what your intentions are?
You know what, during the campaign I talked lots under a theme what I called opportunity for all. And what I meant by that, Todd, was the idea of actually partnering with whether it's First Nation leadership or other municipal leadership in many of the areas of northern Saskatchewan, but creating a connection between them and the private sector to create job opportunities. I think there's so much good comes out of people having the opportunity to have a good job. You know, obviously there's just the financial component, just the economic component to being able to take care of yourself and your family. That's huge. There's a sense of worth and fulfillment that comes from having a good job and being able to get up and go to work every day and participate positively in the things around you. But I think the larger component to that is the sense of hope that's created when our young people in northern Saskatchewan get to see people they respect, maybe their moms and dads, their uncle and aunts, their big brothers, big sisters, or other people they respect around them that have that opportunity and have that sense of worth because they get up and go participate in the economy. And I think that's a really real significant factor in dealing with some of the hopelessness, dealing with some of the suicide crisis, dealing with some of the poverty and some of the challenges we face in northern Saskatchewan. So one of my goals has always been as I engage with the First Nations leadership in northern Saskatchewan, say, you know, I would love to be somebody that helps you facilitate those partnerships, that you can create economic activity, that you can create jobs for your people, because so many of the leaders of those communities get that, and they want to see that, they want to participate in that, and I would love to be able to help them do that.
Do you think, I mean, you've mentioned some of the social problems, of course, that are plaguing First Nations in northern Saskatchewan. Is it, though, just jobs is the answer, or do we need more? There's always talk about treatment centers for mental health, for example.
No, it's not all about jobs. I think the way I phrased that was that's a really significant component of it. I mean, obviously there's education, there's treatment centers, there's mental health and addiction centers. There's so many other components, but I think we need to find ways to package these things together. We need to partner with our First Nations communities and allow them to be part of the process, allow them to be part of the decision-making process that gives them the ability to serve the needs of their people, of their members.
I know you've only been in your role for a few weeks, but how would you characterize the job that Indigenous Services Minister Mark Miller is doing?
You know what? One of the things I've set out to do is to have a positive relationship with my minister opposite, with Minister Miller. So maybe just a real quick story here. When the suicide crisis happened at Makwasagayakan, which is literally about 40 miles from my community, we were literally brand new. We were trying to figure out what life of an MP looks like, and this crisis happened. We had the opportunity to build some relationship with the people out at Makwa, with their leadership, and so when this crisis happened, they reached out to us. And the first thing we did was reach out to Minister Miller's office, and that was before I was the critic. That was just as a member of Parliament. And we were very pleased with his response. I mean, we were able to engage with him and help bring about some solutions to that, hopefully, with the announcement of some funding for that a month later or so. And to Minister Miller's credit, he invited me to participate in that funding announcement in Saskatoon. And I think that's just a sign of kind of the relationship that Minister Miller and myself have tried to create, one that we want to actually potentially work together to help solve issues rather than just be at odds with each other all the time. So I want to really create a positive and unique relationship with him and help him, when I can, serve the needs of the people and not just always criticize.
Of course, as I mentioned before, Cathy McLeod was here quite a bit when she was critic for Indigenous Affairs as a whole. And we know that Conservatives supported certain legislation like the C-91 and C-92. But of course, the Conservatives oppose something like C-262, the UNDRIP bill. Do you foresee that as far as Indigenous policy going forward, that'll be the same thing that Conservatives will support and be against?
I think in regards to the UNDRIP bill, I mean, I think our position has been pretty consistent. We support many of the principles in that document, and the one thing we're troubled by is the free, prior, and informed consent clause, and just making sure that doesn't turn into a veto. There's numerous different legal opinions. I'm sure you've heard all the arguments in your panels and whatnot in the past, so I think we just want to find a way to get past that and make sure that I mean, it goes back to the creation of jobs in these communities, right? There's many First Nations communities that support resource development and support economic development in and around their communities. And we would just want to make sure this gets done right so that we don't limit their opportunity to participate in the economy of Canada for the wealth of their people as well.
Of course, something like C-92, reforming child welfare, needs a lot of funding to be successful. And I know that for the Conservative Party, they're concerned about the deficits that have been growing over the years. So how do you, I suppose, balance the two? A need for something that really needs critical funding, but may cause the deficit to balloon even more?
I think the whole thing, in my talking to the leaders of the communities, and also now in my time in Ottawa, where I've had the opportunity to engage some of the leaders on a national scale rather than just on my riding, which I anticipated when I first came here. One of the common themes, or there's probably three messages I hear from them. One is the funding envelope that doesn't seem to be associated with this, and obviously we'll be watching for that as the budget is announced here in the next couple months. But I think there's also an understanding that, and this is from the communities themselves, this is not my opinion, this is their opinion, that not are all ready for this, right? There's going to have to be some help along the way to help communities get to the place where they're actually ready to take on that responsibility. And so this is not going to happen overnight, it's going to take some time. Yeah, there is going to be some dollars associated with it, but at the same time, I think one of the things that's been lacking in this is the engagement with the provinces on this. I mean, they're the ones that have the responsibility now, and I think if you talk to the provincial leadership on this, they're feeling a little bit left out of this process, where they haven't been part of the engagement. They haven't been part of the process to determine the adequate solutions to make sure that no kids get left out on this. I know that's a significant fear of some of them that I've talked to, that we're talking children here, and we don't want them to get lost in this transition anywhere.
Is that something you could fault Minister Miller and Indigenous Services for, the way this got rolled out?
I probably would be somewhat critical of that. I think there could have been better consultation with the provinces. I think there probably could have been better consultation with the First Nations leadership. Maybe it was a little bit done too fast. It was done maybe in a hurry to get it finalized before the end of the session. This maybe could have been done a little bit better with a little bit more time.
Well, Mr. Vidal, I want to thank you for coming on. It was great to get to know you a bit, and I'm sure you'll be back, especially when we get our Members of Parliament panels up and running again.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
And we'll have more after another short break. Welcome back. Next week we'll have an interview with Jody Wilson-Raybould, and we'll find out what life is now like for her being an independent member of Parliament. As well, we often have parliamentary secretaries on Nation to Nation, but what exactly do they do? Again, next week we'll try to have the secretaries for Indigenous Services and Crown Indigenous Relations drop by the studio. But if you missed any part of tonight's show or a previous one, go to our podcast. That's aptnnews.ca/podcast. I'm Todd Lamoran. Thanks for watching.